Boston Globe article entitled, "For the First Time in 400 Years, Mass Lawmakers Will Vote Remotely." And I asked unanimous consent to insert to the record an April 1st Louisville Courier Journal article entitled, "Kentucky House Dramatically Limits In-Person Voting on Bills Due to Coronavirus Concerns." And with that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my very good friend from the great state of Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you. I'll try to bring up three things that are very wrong with proxy voting that I don't think have been brought up today. First of all, one of the problems we have in this building is, even though we all represent 700,000 people, there are some congressmen who are a great deal more powerful than others. And this bill will greatly increase the power of leadership. Right now, people run into each other in the halls, talk to each other in the cloakroom, question parts of the bill, and sometimes question leadership's narrative. This bill says everybody's going to be back at home, which greatly strengthens the power of leadership because people aren't around to question the bill. Secondly, it lessens bipartisanship. When we're gone, we do have conference calls with other Republicans, but I find I talk to Democrats much more when we're in this building. And by taking people out of this building, you will decrease bipartisanship as you make proxy voting the norm. And finally, you are penalizing the press. We should all be available to the press after these votes so they get a variety of perspectives. But we are going to work our way down to the point where it's the Speaker and a few other Democrats around, and the press are not going to be able to talk to us all. So it's an insult to the press. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an April 22nd Washington Post article entitled, "UK Zoom Parliament Launches with a few glitches, but shows virtual democracy may work for a while, breaking 700 years of tradition." I also ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a March 26 Politico article entitled, "Corona-Era European Parliament, Empty Chamber and E-Voting." And I reserve my time.
Without objection, gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the distinguished ranking member and former chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Walden of Oregon.
Gentleman is recognized. Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Oklahoma, the current Republican leader of the Rules Committee. We are in unprecedented times, and unprecedented times do call for unprecedented actions. But using these times to smash a wrecking ball into the foundation of democratic lawmaking by making government more remote, more isolated from the people, by dramatically centralizing even more power with those few at the top in the majority, while giving the reins of the House to fewer than 25 members who show up with votes with proxies, seems like a return to boss politics. This is not to say there's never room for improvement to the way the House conducts its business, Mr. Speaker. 10 years ago, I led the transition effort for House Republicans, and we looked at ways that we could modernize Congress and improve its operations. But I knew these were matters not to be taken lightly. We needed an inclusive bipartisan approach, and I took great care to solicit input from Democrats and Republicans alike. We even put up a suggestion box. What we did was good work. The changes were relatively small, but the process was robust. Unfortunately, the reverse is true to this proposal. Regular order, accountability, transparency, for the most part, bipartisanship. These are words that have governed the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Republicans and Democrats. As Republican leader of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I'm concerned about what this proposal means for the committees. How do we preserve the rights of all members on both sides of the dais from top to bottom as we zoom through hearings and markups? How do we preserve the integrity of the proceedings? What if there's a technology failure? What if someone makes a mistake using the technology, like accidentally muting another member of themselves? Haven't we all by now experienced the inadequacies of video conferencing? No serious legislator can believe the remote hearings, remote meetings, and remote markups are improved by these changes. Moreover, this rules change further dehumanizes our processes. We all know social media has become a cancer on civility. Further distancing members will not improve our relationships. Think of what gets worked out between members here on the floor or in the committees. We need more bipartisan dialogue in this country, not less. So I urge my Democratic colleagues to withdraw this proposal and work with us to preserve the great democratic traditions of the U.S. House. that will work in this challenging time. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have been inserting various articles into the record showing other states and other parliaments and Congresses across the world operating remotely to prove a point that it can be done. And I don't know whether my Republican friends are just intimidated by technology. I mean, listening to some of them, I think they think bifocals are a radical idea. But the bottom line is we can do this. The United States Senate had a remote hearing, and it worked out just fine. The bottom line is that we're in the middle of a health crisis, a pandemic, and we need to make sure that we can continue to do our work in a safe and orderly way. I mean, if I was cynical, I would think the reason why my Republican friends are against this is to make sure we don't do anything. And I get it. You may not like the fact that we're trying to address the needs and the concerns of the American people. But we are going to do this, and I would urge, I hope we get a bipartisan vote on this. With that, I would like to yield 1 minute to our distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Mr. Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind us today of President Lincoln's words to Congress. He said this: "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. The occasion," he continued, "is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." So said President Abraham Lincoln. So it is today. This occasion is piled high with difficulty, but we must rise to the occasion. Our challenges are piled high, and this House must rise to meet them. We find ourselves in new and unprecedented circumstances. So, Mr. Speaker, we must think anew and act anew. The House has a duty to the American people to do its job, even in a crisis like this one that nobody on this floor has ever experienced. Ever. The House has a duty to the American people to do its job, especially in a crisis like this. Let me say at the outset, Mr. Speaker, that there is no substitute. I want my colleagues to hear me on this. There is no substitute for personal interaction of members in a committee room or on the House floor. I share that view. Mr. McCarthy shares that view. Ms. Pelosi shares that view. Mr. McConnell shares that view. But when that is not possible, because it poses a mortal danger, 86,000 plus of our fellow citizens have died because they contracted COVID-19. It poses a mortal danger to the health of members, staff, press, and the public. And therefore, we must provide an alternative way to do the people's business. Now, let me say that we had a bipartisan task force. At the first task force meeting, Rodney Davis, a Republican from Illinois, said, we want the Congress to be able to work. My colleague said that cynically we could observe that perhaps for those of you who may not be able to garner a majority for what we pass, perhaps you don't want us to work. I hope that's not the case. I know the administration does not want us to do oversight, but that is our responsibility. This resolution will enable the House to conduct its work in full without risking the health and safety of Americans and communities across the country, from which members come and to which they will return.
It allows committees to use remote technology to conduct hearings and mark up legislation. Technology already in use, safely and effectively by millions of Americans, including the Supreme Court. 9 people who have decided they ought to be separated and are therefore doing what has never been done in history. It's not a revolution. They're using technology to do the same thing they could do in the hearing chamber of the United States Supreme Court. Period. The United States Senate, as my colleagues, as so many have observed, held a virtual hearing. The chairman was not there. He was quarantined. The witness was not there. Actually, there are multiple witnesses. They were quarantined. Now, there were, as Mr. McCarthy has suggested, members in the hearing room. So it is what Mr. McCarthy refers to as a hybrid hearing. This rule provides for that. It will also permit the use of proxy voting on the House floor and take steps toward adopting remote voting once a platform has been deemed secure. I had hoped that Democrats and Republicans could move forward with such changes on a bipartisan basis. I absolutely reject any theory that the character of the House is being changed by this rule. Absolutely reject it. My friend is shaking his head. No, it is. Nothing changes. The same people vote. The same issues will be considered. The same witnesses will be heard. The same committee rules will be followed. The only thing that changes is the technology that is available to us. And by the way, when that board is lit up, there were some people thought that was a radical change. I ought to be able to stand on the floor and say aye or nay. And when C-SPAN was introduced, oh my, how radically that would change the House. I reject, I say again, that this is any kind of radical change. What it is the use of technology to accommodate the crisis we confront. We had many productive discussions through our bipartisan task force. I want to thank Mr. Cole. I want to thank Mr. Davis. I want to thank Minority Leader McCarthy. I want to congratulate Jim McGovern, the chairman of the Rules Committee, for his fairness and for his attentiveness to everybody's position. We didn't reach agreement. I'm sorry that we didn't reach agreement. But we took a lot of the ideas that our friends on the Republican side of the aisle suggested. They were good suggestions, and we incorporated them in what we're doing. We're included in this resolution such as requiring any software platforms to be approved by the Chief Administrative Officer. So some technology that is not accepted or proved to work would be used. The Chief Administrative Officer, and allowing committees to hold hybrid hearings, which I just referred to, and both remove in-person participation simultaneously. However, Mr. Speaker, we were unable to reach a consensus on adopting 21st century tools. 21st century tools that would allow the House to meet its constitutional responsibilities during this emergency, which is why Democrats are bringing this resolution to the floor today. I hope, however, with this resolution now on the floor, that Republicans will join us in voting for it, and I urge them to do so. If, in fact, you want the Congress to be able to act and exercise our responsibilities, you'll vote for this rule. Because it simply enables us to do what we have historically done. Held hearings, voted on bills, brought them to the floor, had amendments, and passed them. The only difference being that will be some people, maybe many people, who will be doing so as technology enables us to do virtually. We know that remote technologies work because the committees have already been using them to hold meetings, host forums, and engage in discussions about legislation. Many state legislators, Mr. Speaker, and foreign parliaments have already adopted these technologies successfully. By the way, one of them is Kentucky, for what it's worth. The Washington metro area is still experiencing a high rate of infections, which has not yet peaked. And so our doctor, on whom we rely for some of our health needs, says the best practice would not to be to come together in one room, whether it be a committee room or the floor of the House, but would be to have people have the opportunity to vote remotely. That is why the Capitol physician has cautioned us. At the same time, more than half of those employed here as staff or support workers commute to the Capitol complex on public transit, and they're concerned. We have an obligation to protect them and their families as well. This change, let me repeat this change is not permanent. This is to meet a temporary catastrophe that confronts our country, which we have not seen the like of for over a century. It will not advantage or disadvantage either party. There's no partisan advantage in this rule. None. Zero, zip. And it does not fundamentally alter the nature of the House or how it operates. Let me repeat that. It does not fundamentally alter the nature of the House or how it operates. There is no dangerous precedent. Only a common sense solution to an unprecedented crisis that demands our ingenuity and adaptability as an institution. Now, I said it didn't happen for more than a century. 1918, the Spanish flu. They passed many, many pieces of legislation with 2 or 3 people on this floor. Perhaps you think that's better than the 432 others by technology saying, I vote aye, I vote nay, whether it's in committee or, frankly, on this floor. Indeed, this is how, to paraphrase Lincoln, to think anew and act anew. That's all we're doing. We need to have a system in place not only to deal with the current crisis, but future emergencies, including the possibility that another surge of COVID-19 is going to happen this fall. If we fail to act now, as we failed to act after 9/11, if we fail to act now, we may not be in a lot of trouble come September without the capacity to join us all together in this chamber, but still the capacity to join us all together in participating pursuant to the rules of this House, even though we do so virtually. This resolution isn't just about adopting remote working tools for the House. It's about ensuring that the House of Representatives, the people's House, conducts its constitutional duties of policymaking and oversight effectively and safely. It is about making sure that our system of checks and balances, hear me, I'm not sure the executive department is shedding any tears that we're not here. It's about making sure that our system of checks and balances remains fully in place by keeping the House functioning to the full extent of its abilities, even, as I said, it does so virtually. Frankly, when I say something to people on some of this technology, whether it's Zoom, FaceTime, Teams, WebEx, any other technology of that type, very frankly, when I'm looking at Tom Cole on that, as we did a couple of times, I see him on the screen. I know it's Tom Cole. And when Tom Cole says something, I know that that is what Tom Cole is saying. There's no secrecy here. There's no mirrors, smoke and mirrors. There's no advantage to either party by this. That's why I do not understand that this isn't a bipartisan piece of legislation enabling this body to work in an effective way, albeit virtually. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairwoman Lofgren and the House Administration Committee and Chairman McGovern of the Rules Committee for their tireless efforts on this resolution. And I want to thank all the members who have been patient while we negotiated with Republicans through the bipartisan task force, hoping to produce a resolution that was bipartisan in its authorship. Now, having said that, there is a very fundamental difference. I understand that. Mr. Cole at the hearing offered a scholar's opinion that It would be unconstitutional to do this. Mr. McGovern offered another scholar that it was fully constitutional to do this. So if that is the fundamental difference, I understand. But it's not because it radically changes the way this House works or radically changes the votes of the majority or the minority or radically in any other way changes this House of Representatives to a body that is not representative. This resolution remains bipartisan in its ideas, and I hope it will be bipartisan in its adoption. Once it is passed, I would ask my colleagues to familiarize themselves with its new proxy voting requirements and to adhere strictly to them. That will allow the clerk's office more effectively to fulfill its role of recording and counting members' votes with utmost accuracy. Again, Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to join me and many others in supporting this resolution and permitting the House to do its work safely and in compliance with social and physical distancing practices urged by all of our medical personnel. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been extraordinarily restrained in this debate because I have a lot of speakers that need to have time on the floor to express their feelings. But sometimes when the other side repeatedly says things that are either out of context or deserve a rebuttal, you got to respond. So to my good friends on the other side who have cited the Senate committee, they know in negotiation we said we'd be happy to do exactly that. We just want markups to be in person. So please don't use the Senate committee as if we somehow were opposed to that. Second, my friend said we're intimidated by technology. We're not intimidated by technology. Heavens. We respect tradition and we think there's a better way to do this. And as my friends know, we move toward them in the course of that discussion. And finally, my friend, my very good friend, the chairman said this was a plot maybe to do nothing. We've passed 4 bipartisan pieces of legislation working together. We've done a lot in the last few weeks. And to suggest that we would deliberately sabotage the operation of the House simply because we disagree with you is wrong. And quite frankly, doing nothing is bringing a bill to this floor, which you're getting ready to do, in H.R. 6800, that you know the Senate won't pick up and you know the President won't sign. That's doing nothing. We've proven working together we can do a lot. All we asked is let's return to that. Now, with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, the distinguished member and ranking Republican member on the Homeland Security Committee from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend from Oklahoma. I rise in strong opposition to H.Res. 965. This blatant partisan move to fundamentally alter the way the House and committees operate completely undermines the rights of the minority in over 200 years of precedent. As ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, I'm particularly concerned how this resolution overrides the rules of our committee. At the beginning of the Congress, our committee negotiated with the majority a set of rules that protected minority rights. Now our rules are being thrown out and replaced by regulations written by the chairman of the Rules Committee, regulations that the minority first saw only hours ago. I don't understand why the Speaker, Pelosi, doesn't trust her chairmen and chairwomen to negotiate with their ranking members on ways to accommodate committee business during this pandemic. But apparently, she just doesn't trust them. One of the things that concerns me most about this resolution is that nothing guarantees that Republican members are going to properly be notified and able to fully participate in virtual committee hearings. That may sound petty to you, but unfortunately on my committee, it's already the reality. For the last 2 weeks, Homeland Security Democrats have been holding virtual hearings without notifying Republican members. To make matters worse, they've restricted participation to only a handful of their members. I fear this resolution will only further empower the misconduct on my committee and cause it to spread to others. Worst of all, this is being done for the short-term benefit of the majority and not the American people. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from all ranking members opposing this resolution.
Without objection.
Many of my constituents are showing up to work every day, from grocery store clerks to nurses, doctors, policemen, first responders.
If the House had the resolve and the courage to do the same, we wouldn't need this partisan resolution. This is disgraceful. I urge all members to vote no, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a May 13th letter from Norm Ornstein, a current resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, in support of our plan here.
Without objection.
And in response to the gentleman who just spoke, I don't know what he's talking about, but there's nothing in this. There is nothing in this package that we are presenting that would undermine minority rights. I'm happy to urge him to have his staff contact ours, but what he's talking about has nothing to do with what we're discussing here today. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, distinguished member from Illinois, Mr. Bost.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my friend from Oklahoma for yielding to me. The American people are sacrificing on the front lines. It's already been discussed about the truck drivers, the nurses, and all of that. And I was going to go on to that, but then when I've sat on this floor and I've listened to things that have been said, remember I come from the state of Illinois where over a long period of time, about 35 years, we've seen small moves that sounded so good at the time, giving all their power to the Speaker. All their power given away, which is not what our founding fathers said. Mr. Speaker, the sponsor of this bill has said on several occasions he would like to insert this statement into the record and this article into the record. Well, that does not change the fact of Article 1, Section 5, that is so clear that this is unconstitutional. And I hope, for the sake of the people that I represent, of the people that each one of us represent, that the members will stand against this proposed rule, a rule that gives more power to one person instead of the individuals that we have here that was originally set up. Mr. Speaker, as I direct my comments towards you and the chair, I would like to say this. If you believe that I, as a member, am going to give up by proxy the ability to represent my 720,000 people, that it will not happen. And with that, I yield back. Expired.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah. The good news for the gentleman is he doesn't have to give anything up. Can I inquire from Mr. Cole how many more speakers he has? Because I think I'm prepared to close.
No, Mr. Chairman, I still have a number of speakers.
Okay, all right. I will then reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Hey, can I ask how much time we have, Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 1.5 minutes. Gentleman from Oklahoma has 8.5 minutes.
Do you want to give us any?
We would have needed a different debate for that to happen.
So, gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, distinguished member from Ohio, Mr. Latta.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.Res. 965, which is a flagrant disregard of the Constitution and House traditions. Proxy voting has previously been deliberated in this body. A 1970 amendment was offered to ban all forms of proxy voting in committees. It argued committee members should be present in person to listen, to debate, discuss, and vote. Proxy voting tends to add to the cloud of suspicion hanging over Congress. Use of proxy voting on important bills gives up a member's voice and adds to the appearance of secrecy. In 1974, an amendment was offered to entirely ban proxy voting. It was adopted by this House, but later overturned by the Democrat caucus. A CRS report gave the opponents' views to proxy voting by stating that it contributes to the domination of committee chairs, contributes are passed, and vote no, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my very good friend, the distinguished member from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank my colleague from Oklahoma. You know, our founders used to ride days on horseback, on wagons, through unkind conditions to get to D.C. to do their jobs for all of us at the time. Us, we only have to brave TSA lines and occasionally a delayed flight. You know, the Constitution here did not catch the virus. Why are we voting on a measure here to basically suspend it? These rules have been in place since basically 1789. Mr. Speaker, our constituents elected us to come to Congress and do our job and be their voice in Washington, D.C. This would only mute their voice. Just as ballot harvesting in my state has led to some shady, even fraudulent outcomes, members of Congress should not have to be here to be possibly coerced by certain other members to how their votes should be shaped. We need to be able to show up. It's not that hard, really, at the end of the day. We have a higher calling to come here and do our job and be present, to have these interactions, to have these conversations with our future generations. I urge no on this, and we need to stop and think of what we're doing here.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma's reserved. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, why is it not too big of a health concern to call us back from all across the country to vote on a useless messaging bill that will wither on the vine outside this chamber? But it is too much to ask to come back and hold committee hearings. Proxy voting shouldn't happen. Not now, not ever. If members of Congress are unwilling to do their job, they should step down and let someone else do it. If politicizing a crisis weren't enough, the Speaker is now weakening the core foundations of Congress. Already, House Democrats have demonstrated their expertise at crafting partisan bills behind closed doors, and on the Natural Resources Committee, they have been holding partisan virtual hearings disguised as roundtables with no Republican input. I will concede to my colleagues across the aisle that proxy voting will keep the process moving. The wrong process, the wrong direction, and for all the wrong reasons. So I'm not only concerned about how we will be voting, I'm also concerned about what we will be voting on. Is the plan now for a handful of members to come back to D.C. every other week to vote on yet another messaging bill from the Speaker? This is wrong, and none of us should stand for it. Republicans are ready to get back to real work. Speaker Pelosi, please quit playing games with the rules and let us do our jobs. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished member from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was listening to the Majority Leader talk about a statement that Abraham Lincoln made. He made it in his annual report to the Congress on December 1, 1862. And in that message, he proposed one of the dumbest ideas that has ever been put forth in this Congress. And that was, instead of freeing the enslaved people in this country, we would round them up and put them on boats and take them back to Africa. That's what was in this message. He talks about the tired dogmas of the past. The Constitution is not dogma, it is the fundamental law of this country. And remember, in December 1, 1862, this Congress was in this room. 50 miles away 10 days later, a fierce, awful battle took place in Fredericksburg, 18,000 casualties. If it hadn't been winter, the Confederate Army could have come up here and taken this building. Yet they continue to meet here. Through pandemics, yellow fever, malaria, this was the hottest spot in the country for typhoid fever for over 15 years. The Congress still met in this room. Millions of Americans go to work every day doing their jobs, and they expect us to do the same. Instead of adopting this very ill-considered rule, we should all get to Washington.
Yeah. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my very good friend from the great state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Well, I thank my
gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank my good friend, the gentleman from Oklahoma. Mr. Speaker, this isn't about changing the rules to get things done. This is about changing the rules to hide what's done and who has done it. This rule would change what's going to happen shortly here, which a bill provides another $1 trillion to state and local governments in addition to the funds provided under the CARE Act. Now, much of the $1 trillion already sent to the states has yet to be unspent. You take my own state, the home state of Pennsylvania, where the governor there has withheld CARES Act funding and extorted the counties to go along with his indefinite shutdown the untimely deaths of hundreds and thousands in nursing homes, and the bankruptcy of many of our citizens. This unnecessary and unconstitutional mandate has resulted in 1.8 million Pennsylvanians losing their jobs. We're fifth in population and number one in unemployment and one or two in untimely deaths in nursing home. Despite all of the CARE Act funds that we've already given, 41 days is what it takes on the average for somebody to receive unemployment benefits run by the state. More money isn't going to help anything here, Mr. Speaker. Not one more cent. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my very good friend from the great state of Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank you, my friend from Oklahoma. And Mr. Speaker, I had the experience just last week in a virtual hearing to be able to push, when it came my turn, push the mute off button on the microphone, and it didn't work. I was passed over. Then when I texted in to find out why, I was told, well, that's too bad. We'll catch you at the end. The only place for us to be in this Congress is where we're supposed to be, and that's here. We ought to be doing our work together. Let me read you a quote from General Omar Bradley, a famous general who understood the cost of leadership. He said of Athenians, in the end, more than they wanted freedom, they wanted security. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all: security, comfort, and freedom. When the freedom they wanted most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free. Ladies and gentlemen, together we work for the freedom of this country. Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you, if I'm not willing to do what's necessary to be here, it's time for me to consider turning over somebody else. I would suggest that ought to be for all of us who are privileged to represent people in this august body, not like any other parliamentary body in the world, not like under a state legislature. This is the U.S. Congress. Let's act like it.
Time
and I
has
yield
expired.
back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I have a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. I have a parliamentary inquiry.
I'm sorry. A gentleman would state his inquiry.
The gentleman just said that we had an official virtual hearing in the House. I want to know whether or not, under the rules that currently exist, is it allowed for there to be official hearings virtually or remotely?
Chair doesn't comment on committees' proceedings.
I'll take
it is
that
a matter for debate.
I'll take it as there was not a hearing. Thank you. It's not a hearing.
Gentleman from Massachusetts controls the time unless if he reserves. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot today that the Republican plan was simply to prioritize testing for members of Congress. Actually, it's a great deal more than that, as my friends know. It's much more expansive, much more complete. So I asked, Mr. Speaker, unanimous consent to include the Republican plan authored by the distinguished Republican leader, Mr. Davis of Illinois, and myself into the record without objection.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Republican leader of the House of Representatives, Mr. McCarthy of California.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his work, and Rodney Davis's as well. Unfortunately, it did not come to the place where we could have a bipartisan agreement. Now, Mr. Speaker, today isn't just a day for debate. It's also a day for remembrance. It is Peace Officers Memorial Day and the second to last day of Police Week. So before I begin, I want to say thank you to everyone who serves as a police officer or as the family member of a police officer, including our wonderful Capitol Police and their families, who do an incredible job protecting this campus, its employees, and its visitors. As the guardians of peace, you are on the front lines every day. Despite the danger, you are undeterred from performing your duty. As a son of a firefighter, I know that you do not do your job for recognition or praise, but you truly deserve our gratitude, especially now. So thank you for everything you do from a very grateful Congress. Now, Mr. Speaker, the work of our frontline heroes is the definition of essential. It cannot be done remotely or by proxy. Why should Congress be any different? We are supposed to represent the people. We should strive to show a level of determination in our important work that is worthy of the police officers we honor today. The American people expect us to do our part to defeat this virus, just like they are doing on a daily basis. Mr. Speaker, Speaker Pelosi said in this exact chamber just a few weeks ago, and I quote, "We are captains of the ship. We are the last to leave." But proxy voting calls on Congress to abandon the ship and be the first to leave for months or possibly for the rest of the session. The Speaker is on the brink of launching the most significant power grab in the history of Congress. It runs counters to 230 years of House rules and even the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, our founders would be ashamed that we aren't assembling. I want every American to understand what it means for their members of Congress, to whom they lend their voice in Washington. It means that you can stay home for the rest of the year, but still get paid for the rest of the year, where many Americans will not be paid. It means that they can let someone else, Speaker Pelosi, consolidate power and do their job for them when they could do it for themselves. And it means that they will only participate in legislative theater while shutting your voice out for the real lawmaking process. A virtual Congress would be a Congress that is connected to the internet but disconnected from the American people. That isn't fair to our constituents, our colleagues, or our country. And it undermines the very purpose of representative democracy as our founders designed it. Roger Sherman, the only founder to sign all 4 great state documents, said in 1789, I'll pause until they're quiet, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
Chairman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Roger Sherman, the only founder to sign all 4 great state documents, said in 1789, when the people have chosen a representative, it is his duty to meet others from different parts of the Union and consult and agree with them to such acts as are for the great benefit of the whole community. Sherman is right. Especially in a pandemic, our presence here, our Congress together matters. It matters to our constituents. It matters to our institution. And it matters to all of those who will come after us. This pandemic has claimed too many lives and livelihoods already. We must now allow this great body we are charged with safeguarding to be the next casualty if you pass this bill. In fact, aren't we proving today that we don't need a virtual Congress? In the middle of this virus, the House is conducting its business while following the health guidelines. We can do that at a committee level too. Our Republican colleagues, Mr. Cole, Mr. Davis, has submitted that plan for the People's House, for the committees to work in a safe manner. It is the only side that has produced a plan. And it was a bipartisan plan to move forward. It is about more than reopening a campus. It is about restoring America's voice. We don't have to choose between the health of our capital community and the health of this institution. We can continue to work in a safe and effective manner without overturning 230 years of constitutional and legislative tradition. Remote voting should be the final and last option, not the first and only. Unfortunately, rather than allowing the most reasoned voices to prevail on this crucial matter, my friends across the aisle have surrendered to the loudest voice. Mr. Speaker, as I look at this reckless proposal, I am reminded of what the great American author James Fenimore Cooper said in 1838. He said, "The most dangerous attacks on freedom are made by the largest trustees of authority in their efforts to increase their power." Mr. Speaker, I believe that's worth hearing again. It was said in 1838, "The most dangerous attacks on freedom are made by the largest trustees of authority in their effort to increase power." Cooper was correct, and that should concern each and every one of us this Congress. A Congress that is a voice of people that are lent the voice throughout this nation to 435 members will now shrink to 20. We were warned that the dangers of freedom will come from those who the trustees of authority. We were warned, so maybe today would never happen, but now we are witnesses of it. In a few minutes, we'll be given the opportunity to make that choice. Will your legacy be what Cooper had warned the nation about? I hope it will not. If you are okay with overturning 230 years of tradition and allowing 20 members to control Congress, then vote for this resolution. If you enjoy being cut out of the lawmaking process, then vote for this resolution. If you ran to get a title but are willing to give your vote in return, then vote for this resolution. But if you think our Congress still matters, if you think the people's voice still matters, I urge all my colleagues to vote no. I know each and every one of you will honor the police for doing their job. Each and every one of you will honor all those in the medical community for doing their job. I know you'll honor the delivery driver. You'll honor the cashier. You'll honor those who are behind the check stands at Home Depot or in the grocery store, because you think what they're doing is essential. I hope you look deep in your heart, because when you asked your constituents to vote for you because you believed the job you were running for was essential for the nation, because I believe it is, I want you to look at your vote. Because if you believe 20 should have the power, if you believe you should have the title and not do the job, if you believe you should be paid while you stay home, I think we have a difference of opinion. I believe our work is essential, and I believe we're proving we can do it. I believe the Speaker when she said just a few weeks ago that we are captains of the ship, that we will be the last to leave, not the first to abandon it like you will today. A vote for this resolution is a vote to abandon this House, to abandon the Constitution, to abandon 230 years of tradition. You'll still have your title, you'll have no power, and worst of all, your constituents will have no voice. I lend back.
Gentlemen, members are reminded that any comments or statements should be directed to the chair. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves.
With that, Mr. Speaker, actually, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the distinguished minority leader asked the question, why should we be treated differently from anyone else in this country? That's actually a very good question. And that's why we rejected his proposal and his idea that members of Congress get preferential treatment, that we move to the front of the line with regard to tests at a time when our doctors and our nurses and our teachers and volunteers in homeless shelters and in food banks can't get a test. But somehow we are so special that we should move to the front of the line. We rejected that. And quite frankly, it is one of the reasons why people have a bad feeling sometimes about Congress, is when they hear those kinds of suggestions. Quite frankly, I'm ashamed that even that idea was brought forward in a serious way. I know they do this at the White House, but the idea that we would step ahead of everybody else doesn't make any sense. Mr. Speaker, to hear some of my Republican friends, you'd think this House conducts its business today in 2020 just as it did in 1798. But that's just not true. A lot has changed these last 230 years, from the way we vote to the way we count a quorum. Americans are watching and they're listening to this debate live right now because of action Congress took decades ago to adapt to new technology. The changes that we're talking about here aren't permanent ones like that. These are temporary, to be used only during this pandemic. Once it is over, we go back to working side by side and in person. State legislatures and governments around the world have already acted to make remote voting possible. I really don't know why some people here believe this House is somehow different. We cannot afford to let this pandemic stop our legislative work in our tracks. And I would say to the Minority Leader, we want to do our work, and we want to do the oversight to make sure that the administration...
No? The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I would request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed.